started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. So my name is Dr. Brooke. I'm in the psychology department, and I'm going to be your moderator for this session. The title of the session is Influences and Consequences. We have 3 students who are slated to present research during this session. We have Patrick Akande, Zoe Nelson, and Robert Dougherty-Bliss. Zoe is unfortunately not feeling well. She contacted me about an hour ago, and she's unable to make the presentation. We have 2 phenomenal presentations lined up for you. So we're going to invite Patrick up first to present. The title of his talk is going to be Cryptography and Illustrations of Ciphers.
First, let me ask you guys a question. Have you always had that one friend you always want to share information with? We always have that nosy individual that's always coming into your conversations and want to know everything y'all are talking about? Well, now you can actually block them out. It's what we call cryptology. Cryptology is the study of basic ciphers. Well, in this case, we're going to talk about the basic ones. We're not going to talk about the difficult ones. These ones, you can actually use them in time to time. So first, before we talk about cryptology, we want to talk about something very important in math. Congruences. First, we need to understand what congruence even means. When a number is congruent to another number, more than another number, it means that the difference between them is a multiple of the number. Now, for example, if you notice 13 is congruent to 6.7 because 13 minus 6 is 7. And 7, of course, is a multiple of 7. But also another one is 25 is congruent to 13 because 25 minus 13 is 12. And 12 is a multiple of 3. But the question is, why is this important? So we need to talk about putting the letters to their numerical equivalent. So we're going to match each letter to an individual number, starting from 0, not 1, because 0 is actually the easiest number to add anything to or multiply to. Anything as far as 0 is 0, and anything to 0 you get whatever that thing is. So, and plus, 0 is congruent to 26, because if we're doing a mod 26, 26 minus 0 is 26, and 26 is a multiple of itself. So that's why we're going to use 0, starting from the beginning. Now let's talk about the first cipher, called the character cipher. So the character cipher is basically like mapping one letter to another letter. An example of this is the Caesar cipher, used by Julius Caesar, when he shifted the letter D to the letter A, the letter E to the letter B, and so on and so forth. That's like shifting each letter to 3. And if you get to the end, you shift it back. So X will map to A. So in this case, character ciphers use what we call affine transformation. An affine transformation means making a one-to-one correspondence between one letter to another letter. One-to-one correspondence means nothing else is going to be mapped to that letter. And then, before we talk about too much in ciphers, here's some key notes you need to know. The P represents the plain text. The plain text is what you're trying to encode. And the C is the cipher text, what you have, your message that's encoded. And the A and B in this case, specific to character ciphers, are what we call the keys of them. These are the things you want to share with your people so they'll know what you're actually doing. And something very important about that A and B, A and 26 must have nodes, so you have no common divisors. Because if they do, you will not get every letter in that cipher text. Now, for example, if A is 2, you cannot get every letter in that C, every number in that C format. So let's give an example in this case. So let's talk about this brilliant plaintext, math is life. So we're going to use this affine transformation we have here. C is congruent to 15p plus 4 mod 26. So first, you want to separate your plaintext into spaces because you don't want people to know how long your sentence is and what spaces it is. So the common use is usually 5 spaces. So here's what we have here. I turned it into numerical equivalence for you guys to get some happens with math as well. So let's do it for the first letter. The first letter is M. 15, M is 12 because M is the 13th letter, but we're going to shift it down by 1 because A was the first letter and moved it to 0. So we're going to just plug and chug into the equation. So we're going to have 15 times 12 plus 14. Don't worry about the math. It's congruent to 12 mod 26. So as you can see, the cipher text first letter, 12 is M. So basically M is going to be mapped back to itself. And that means nothing else is going to be mapped to M because it's a one-to-one correspondence. That's the most important thing about character ciphers. So after doing some tedious work, you're going to get that last cipher text right there. And if you could check, every letter is mapped to every different letter. A is not mapped to any other letter except for O, and so on and so forth. And now let's talk about the decryption of character ciphers. But in this case, we're going to talk about it with the key. That's if the person actually knows what the key is. So if the person knows what the key is, obviously, if you're making a one-to-one correspondence to the ciphertext, you must also make a one-to-one correspondence back to the plain text. That's why you also need another affine transformation, which is this junk right here. So the most important part is that they are not the same compared to the ones before. Because you know, we had C is congruent to A, E plus B. But D is not equal to A and E is not equal to B. Because if you do, it'll be mapped to something completely different and you'll not get what you want. So here is a good example right here. Ugly that's right there. And we're going to turn them into their numerical equivalents. And then we're going to take for the first letter F. So F is 5. F is the sixth letter of the alphabet. Again, plug and chug. Don't worry about the math. It's 3. And 3 is D in the plain text in this case. So when we have this plain text, you see all this rubbish right here? This is what we're going to use an English language to separate this stuff together. So after you do all the nice work, we're going to get this nice plain text right here. Do not reveal the secret, even though it is a secret. So we're going to go to the next one. What if you don't have the key? What if you're trying to break into someone else's code? You know, being the mysterious person you really are. So we're going to use something what we call frequency analysis. Basically checking how much the letters is common in the sentence. This table represents how many times the letter pops up in a common sentence. As you can see here, E appears the most in there, and T appears the second. E appears 13%, and T appears 9%. And this is important because we're going to map the one with the most common in that sentence to E, and the second most common to T. We only need 2 because our key is only 2, A and B, or T and D, depending on how you envision it. So using this table, we're going to work here. So these are long ciphertext right here. But wait, I'm not going to count it for you. This is the table right there. Don't worry about it. So M is the most common, appearing 7 times, and R appears the second most common. So M is going to be mapped to E, and R is going to be mapped to T. And using this, you're going to get 2 equations. And some of the equations is a nice algebra. We're going to get this affine transformation right here. And using this affine transformation on this ciphertext we have, we're going to get this nice plain text. Still doesn't make any sense, so we're going to space it out. This is what we're going to get. Every alchemist of ancient times never told me to code, which is not true. I watch Full Metal Alchemist. You can't do that. So we're going to go to the next cipher, which is the Vigenère cipher. So the character cipher required 2 numbers to be the key. The Vigenère goes even more. Vigenère actually requires a word to be the key of this case. So we're going to use this word to encrypt the plain text to enter the ciphertext. This is a great example. The plain text is 1 million, and key is string. I don't know. So we're going to use the key numerical equivalent to turn the key into its numerical equivalent. And we're going to space out the plain text because, of course, we don't want people to know what we're actually doing. So, but I'm going to take that first 6 gram, that 1 mil, and then we're going to encode it into a ciphertext. So this is what we have here. I just recopied it from the last page here so y'all can actually see it. So in Vigenère ciphers, we're going to add each number in their respective position. So for example, plain text here is 14 and 19. So it's 14 plus 19, which is 33. But 33 is bigger than 26. So you want to minus 26 from it. So 32 minus 26 is 7, because 33 minus 7 is 26, which is, so it's 33 times 7. And doing all this humongous math, we're going to get this nice number separation right here. And if you actually compare it to the letters, you're going to get this 6 gram HEEUBD. And also notice when you look at that plain text and that's N is mapped to E, and E is also mapped to E, which means that one-to-one correspondence is gone. And since that one-to-one correspondence is gone, your cipher is actually a whole lot better. Trust me, it's a whole lot And then when you have this 6 spaces, you don't want them to know how long your key is. So you're going to separate it into, well, we're going to use 5 because 5 is the most common. And we have this right here. So, and also I didn't talk about something in the character cipher. What we did in the frequency thing, that was only because it was a guess. We only guessed that E was the most common, M was the most common in that cipher test. If M was not the most common, it's up for grabs. You don't know how to do it. And in the character ciphers, it's actually easy to figure out if you have a computer. So your computer is the ultimate cheat code if you want to break the cipher text in. Character cipher. So, but this is just for visionary. And I didn't talk about some history about it, did I? So, actually, visionary ciphers wasn't done by a visionary. It was done by an Italian named Giovanni Battista Galasso. So, he did it in the 1500s, long ago, and then 30 years later, visionary showed up. I showed it to King Henry III, and he was like, you know, this is kind of good. And then 400 years later, people forgot about the Italian, so this went with the French guy. So, this is what we have, visionary ciphers. So, poor Giovanni didn't get his work done. So, now we're going to talk about the decryption with the key for visionary ciphers. So, this is our cipher text right here, and this is our key. I'm going to turn the key and the cipher to the numerical equivalence right here. We're going to talk about our first one just like we did in the encryption. This is what we have. Remember in the encryption, we had to add them. In this case, we're going to subtract them instead of add. So we're going to take the cipher text and minus it in the 20. So 22 minus 18 is 4. And then 1 minus 4 is -3, which is below 0. So you want to add 26 to get it in between 0 and 26. So it will be 26 plus -3, which is 23. So we're going to do this whole math right here, and you're going to get this 6 numbers right here. And comparing it to the letters, you're going to get this first 6 numbers. So we're going to get this off of plain text. And if you separate it right, you're going to get this. Explosives, stop. You're not explosives, don't worry. So, something about visionary ciphers, we're not going to do it without the key because that takes forever. We are not doing that. And plus, it's hard to guess it because the visionary ciphers not only requires the key, also requires the key length. We don't know how long the word is. The word could be anything for all we know. It could be 10 letters long, 20 letters long, who knows? And that is the most important part about our visionary cipher. If you know the key length though, you can solve it. But the key length is like the major part of the visionary ciphers. Okay, so now we're going to go to the most fun part of this whole presentation, the Playfair cipher. The Playfair cipher was done by a guy named Wheatson, and it was actually advertised by his friend, Lord Playfair. He introduced it to the British Empire, but they said it was too hard to understand. Doesn't make sense, you guys get this. But they eventually used it in World War I and World War II against Ukraine. What happened in World War II. So this is what Playfair text is used. But people figured out how to actually do this, so this is not used anymore because computers are made. Ultimate cheat code. So the Playfair cipher actually requires a box. Does anybody know Oglethorpe's Latin motive? Can someone please tell me? Michael, I saw your hand up. What you got? Good. Is nescit there. So we're going to use that first part. N-E-S-C-I-T. C is already in there. And we have E is already in there. D is already in there. R and E. I'm going to use motive. M-O-T-T-O. Now we're going to name all the we're going to do all the alphabets with A to Z from there. Counting for all the stuff that's already in there. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. Notice J is not in here because it's 25 letters, because you need 25 letters to make a 5 by 5 box. So J has to be the one that loses his fidelity. Okay. So we're going to let I equal to J. So if you want to use J, use J here instead of I. So also it's not specific. You can use it for anything. So but it's just I just looks like J. So we just let J have the cut. So we have K, L, M, N. You can check this. So this is our plain text right here. Infidel method. What we're going to do is we're going to break it into bigrams, which means pairs of letters. This is what happened here. Yeah. So if you check for IN is in the same row. And since they're in the same row, we're going to shift everything to the right. So I can go to the right to come all the way back here. So I is going to go to N. And N is going to move here. So N is going to go to E. So what we have is IN is going to be encrypted to NE. Right? Now the next one. FI is in this rectangle right here. FI. So we're going to check the horizontal part of FI. So F is going to go to H. I is going to go to S. So since FI is going to turn to HS in that order, you have to follow the order of how you find that letter. Now the next one, DE, is in that same column. So you're going to shift it down. So D is going to go to B, and E is going to go to D. So DE is going to be encrypted to BD. And then when you do all that using plaintext ciphers, you're going to get this plaintext, this ciphers is going to get. Notice that I is mapped to N, and also S is mapped to N. So again, the one-to-one correspondence is gone. So you know how terrible the character cipher is. Although it's still kind of good, but yes, it's pretty bad. But we don't want to leave it in the spacing, so we're going to space it again to 5, so we have this. So that's what we have. So I'm not going to do decryption because of the time, but in summary, this is what you want to do. Character ciphers are the easiest one. If you want to go away and just do it real quickly, character ciphers is the way to go. And then there's the plaintext cipher. The plaintext cipher is second, mostly because of that box. The box is very specific, and it takes like 25 to 24 to 32 other ways to one ways to do it. And then the hardest one is the visionary ciphers. Visionary ciphers are hardest because of that key length. You don't only need to know what the word is, but also what the key length is. If you don't know the two of them, you're good as done. Also, again, cheat code is good for play fair and character ciphers because computers can basically break anything, apart from visionary cipher stuff. But if you know the key length, you're good as done. But here is the play fair decryption. Here are two of them. I'm not going to do them now, but just so you know, when you want to decrypt them, when in the column, you shifted it down. So if you want to decrypt it, you shift it up. And when you want to, and in the same row, you're going to shift it left instead of right. And the same rectangle, you could do the same thing when it comes to rectangle. So I'm not going to do this right now, but you guys can do this at home. I trust you guys are going to love the messages that come out of these things. Also, if there are any questions about this common letter, because you and you are together, just leave it as you and you. You don't need to shift it up or down anything. You can leave it as you and you. So, that's all I have for today. Any questions?
Why is it easy to solve the visionary cipher if you know the key length? Because wouldn't there still be, like, if your key length is 5, wouldn't there still be like 27 to 50 you have to try?
Well, for the visionary ciphers, if you know the key length, now it just depends on like the first letter, but like 26 ways, 25, 26, 26. So it'd be like 26 to 7.
Like, that's a lot.
It is a lot, but with a computer, it's quick. So, yeah, it is tedious if you're doing it on paper, but if you're doing it with a computer, which is the ultimate cheat code, yeah, you can break it. Yeah?
I wasn't able to keep track of what all the codes were called, but this is one where you would assign the most common letter to E and the second most common letter to C. What would you do in the instance if there were two letters that had equal number of appearances, or if you did that, you would assign E to the most common and T to the second most common and kind of nonsense.
Yeah, so that one is just up for grabs. You can do anything. It's just, well, it requires that you just break it, basically. So, yeah, it is tough, but it is doable. It's okay. Because it's a character cipher, so character ciphers basically broken with the computer. And character ciphers are the only ones that really require frequency analysis better. You could do it for a play pair, but the bigrams are shaped differently. There's no one-to-one correspondence. respondents. So you can't really do the frequency analysis like that so easily. What? No. Sadly, no, because computers can break anything. But a harder one, which is actually still used to this day, is the RSA encryption. The RSA is used to exponents rather than just addition or subtraction. So that one is actually more difficult.
Next we have Robert Dougherty-Bliss coming up. He's going to be talking to us about how to rig elections.
So, today we're going to be talking about elections. Everyone here, who's voted? Every hand better go up if you're a citizen here. Okay, so we're going to be talking specifically about congressional elections in the United States. So I want to start, I'm used to giving a lot of talks where people don't know exactly what I'm talking about, and I like to dispel some misconceptions that you might have about the topic I'm going to discuss. So I want to start off by dispelling a misconception you might have about democracy. Okay, so a lot of people think that if you want to win elections in a democracy, you should go out and convince voters that you're right. And I'm really happy that you think that, because someone needs to think that. What a blessed life you must live, living under that blanket of security. But actually, as long as there have been elections, there have been underhanded ways to win elections. It's true that you mostly go out and convince people that you're right and they should vote for you, but there are always tricks that you can try to tilt the odds in your favor a little bit. So today we're going to talk about one of those tricks known as gerrymandering. Has anyone ever heard of that before? A few people, some very important Supreme Court cases going on right now. Maybe you've heard of some of those. But let's make sure we're all on the same page. So quick civics lesson. The United States is not a direct democracy. We are a representative democracy. So big national matters, citizens don't vote on them directly. We elect representatives to vote in our place. Part of that is that we elect people to serve in the House of Representatives. So this is the one where every state gets a certain number of representatives as determined by population. So Texas gets something like 36 representatives, and Wyoming gets 1, I think, as an example for how big Texas is. And what happens is these representatives don't represent the entire state. Instead, they just represent one tiny portion of the state known as their congressional district. So every state is carved up into pieces known as districts, and when you vote to elect someone to Congress, you don't elect someone for the whole state, you just elect someone for the district that you live in. So Oglethorpe here is in the Georgia 6th congressional district, right? So if you live in Brookhaven or somewhere nearby, you would elect someone to represent the 6th district, not the whole state of Georgia. That good so far? Everyone on board? Hope the citizens follow this so far, at least. Okay, so every 10 years or so, when we have a census, we redraw these congressional districts. And it turns out, how you draw these maps is incredibly important to who can win the elections. It has a gigantic influence. And drawing the maps so that it helps your party win elections is known as gerrymandering. Good with the definitions? All right, let's take a look at some pictures. So this is a kind of toy example. I just want to show you, because it doesn't seem immediately obvious that gerrymandering is actually something that's possible. So here's a toy example to show you that it can work. So on the left, we have a map of a fake state carved up into 2 different kinds of voters. There are yellow party voters and green party voters. Nothing to do with the actual Green Party, just some colors that I picked. So 60% of the voters vote yellow, 40% vote green. On the right here are 2 different ways you can divide up the state into districts. So 5 districts, all the same population, so number of blocks in each. This middle one here seems like a pretty good natural way to do it. I think the lines are bold enough for you guys to see it. Are those lines there? So the first one, you just cut straight across the middle to make 5 evenly spaced districts. And when you do that, the yellow voters win every single district. They have a majority in all of the districts, so if they vote together, they get 100% of the representation. That means that the Green Party, 40% of the population, gets 0% of the representation. That's one way you can gerrymander. It's pretty easy for yellow because they have such a big majority here. On the other side, though, if you draw the map a little more cleverly, if you split up the yellow voters in just the right way, and you pack the green voters in just the right way, you can actually swap is the word I'm looking for, representation. So now green wins 3 of the districts and yellow only wins 2, which means that that 60% of the population, yellow voters, only gets 40% of the representation, and vice versa. So depending on how you draw these maps, you can completely swing the representation of a state. And this is just a dumb toy example, but this happens all the time in the real world as well. And I want to show you an actual example, and now I'm wondering how I'm going to do this. Let me see if there's internet on this laptop. This might work. Let's see, definitely a laptop. Okay, everyone close your eyes. Oh wait, never mind, I can block. Sweet, okay. Nobody look. Oh. This is the one thing I didn't practice. It would work if the colors were red or blue as well, as you might guess. Let's see if I can scroll that. Okay, here we go. All right, there we go. So this, I'm a little in the way, I can tell. I'll kneel down. This is Texas's 30th congressional district, as it was in 1959. You will note it is literally a square. There's nothing complicated about the district. It serves most of Dallas at this point in time, and I want to show you how it evolved over time. So in 1959, it was just a square. Then it shifted over to the west side of Dallas, and now it's a little more jagged, it's smaller, the population grew, but it's still got some square-like tendencies to it, right? There's still some straight lines. It morphed a little bit. It jumped over to the east side of Dallas. It morphed again. Some small changes. But all the way through, it's still kind of got this square shape going on, even though the edges are kind of jagged and weird, right? And then it does this. So this was the 30th Congressional District in 1993. If you zoom in, you can actually see that what's happened here is that neighborhood by neighborhood, the map makers went through and decided who was going to live in the district and who wasn't. So you see here, this part of this neighborhood is in the district. Just down the street, not in the district. Further down the street, in the district. This was done by Democrats in Texas to gerrymander their way into a congressional district. I believe this targets African-American neighborhoods to re-elect a congressman they wanted in office. And it is probably one of the most egregious examples of gerrymandering where they don't even try and hide it. It looks so disgusting, you know they had to do something weird for it to work. Now, a judge in Texas struck this down, and it doesn't look like that anymore. It's morphed a little bit over time, and now it looks like that. So, back to a square with still some jagged stuff going on. But I just wanted to show you that the districts can run the gambit from actually just squares to like strings of rope that have clearly been strung around to include and exclude certain people. Make sense? All right, back to the presentation. You can see other examples of that on the ACLU's What the District website, which is what I was using there, and 538 also has a redistricting project that you can look at some cool examples there. So I want to talk about, real quick, why we care about gerrymandering. Because it's easy to look at and say, oh, this is just, some political tool that people use to win elections, and isn't that what politics is anyway, so who cares, right? But I want you to walk away today with the idea in your mind that if you think democracy and representation is a good thing, then gerrymandering is definitely a bad thing. And I want to use an example in the state of California back in 2000. So, in 2000, California redrew their congressional districts right after the census. From 2002 to 2010, there were 265 general elections in the state of California. Of those, only a single incumbent lost their seat. Just one. There was a lot of change in the rest of the country during this time period. For instance, we went from Bush to Obama, so from a Republican president to a Democrat president. But California saw none of that change. And the reason is they gerrymandered the hell out of their state. So California Democrats paid mapmakers $20,000 apiece to draw districts that were favorable for them. And one of the state Democrats said, if my colleagues are smart, they'll pay their 20 grand and get a district they can win. Those that have refused to pay, God help them. So gerrymandering was intentionally set up to reduce competition in the state and suppress representation. And it's even a little more insidious than that. It's not just suppressing representation and reducing competition, it also explicitly targeted minorities. So there was a state Democrat who called up some attorneys that were working on drawing the maps, and she had some complaints about what was being done. and she called them up, and she said, hey, listen, you're not going to put another fucking Asian in my district, all right? And this is what state Democrats were explicitly saying to map makers. Do not put these minorities in my district. I do not want to represent them. This is the kind of thing that gerrymandering does all the time, because your ethnicity, your economic status, that's closely tied with your political affiliations. So you can explicitly target minorities most of the time and get the effect that you want. This all makes sense? So remember, gerrymandering, bad stuff. So you might be thinking, if gerrymandering is so bad, if it's such an evil thing, why hasn't anyone come along and said, hey, stop that, you shouldn't do that? And the reason is, who's gonna do it? So politicians like gerrymandering because it's good for them, at least more than it's bad for them, right? Courts are really the only other people that could step in and say anything about gerrymandering. They could step in and say, this is illegal, or it's unconstitutional, or something like that. But the problem is that that's a tricky argument to make because courts don't like to get involved in drawing maps for states. There's an argument that goes in the courts, there's two sides to it. One side says, drawing maps for a state is a political question. That's them deciding how they should run their state, where resources should get allocated. That's not a problem for the courts. That's their game. The other side says, well, yes, but how you're drawing these maps is infringing on the rights of citizens, and courts should get involved. And there's been kind of a bitter back and forth for decades, and not either side has ever really come out on top yet. It was only in 1962, there was this landmark case called Baker versus Carr, where the Supreme Court very narrowly decided, yes, we can theoretically say something about redistricting. But since then, there hasn't been really any progress on the gerrymandering front, as far as the Supreme Court goes. And one big problem is, for a court to say that gerrymandering is wrong, it needs to say what gerrymandering is. You need to establish when something has been gerrymandered. You need to prove that it happened, not just suggest that it happened. So with that in mind, I want to show you some rules of thumb that we have for determining when something is gerrymandered. All right, everyone ready? It's an important list. Number one, weird-looking districts are probably bad. Texas's 30th looks incredibly strange, so you probably had to make it that way somehow. You probably gerrymandered it. Everyone on board with one? All right, good. Number two is refer back to number one, because that's really sometimes the best one that we have. There are other ways to measure gerrymandering, but they all have a big problem. And, well, they all have a couple problems, but they share one common one. And the problem is, how do you actually take this measurement in context? So all of the measurements that people put forward to say, you give me a map, I'll tell you how gerrymandered it is, they all depend on a couple state-specific factors. For instance, the geography of the state. A state that has more jagged edges might have more jagged districts. It just makes sense. Whereas something like Wyoming only has one district and it's a rectangle. That's not that weird. Or it depends on the voter distribution, where voters live in the state, and that can change some of these measurements that people try and make. And so it's impossible for a court to come along and say, if you get this number, then you've gerrymandered. Because the number would be different for every state. And courts are real uncomfortable when they don't know what the threshold actually is. So that means you need a better way to measure. Who here knows some statistics? Like 4 hands went up. That's cool. All right. That's interesting. All right. So here is the winning idea, we think. This is very new stuff, like just in the past decade or so. You take a map that someone drew, and you want to show that it's been gerrymandered. So what you do is you say that this map is an outlier compared to all possible maps that could have been drawn. And that way you don't need to set an explicit threshold, you just show this map is weird in comparison to the other maps. Does that idea make sense? Okay, what's a problem that you can think of showing that one map is weird in comparison to all other maps? What was that? There are a lot of maps, right. So it turns out there's not quite infinitely many because they have to obey some constraints, but there are way too many to count even with a computer. So you need to do something a little bit smarter. And it turns out that something a little bit smarter is find a way to randomly sample maps. So has anyone ever heard of this idea of like you randomly sample some stuff and you show that maybe what you saw was an outlier from among the random sample, things like that? So that's just a basic statistical question. So I want to show you what this idea might look like in practice. So here is the congressional map of Georgia, as it currently is today. Probably won't look like that in 2 years because the census is coming around. That's what it looks like now. Can everyone see the colors? Different colors just mean different districts. They don't mean anything else. So here is a different map. A randomly sampled map. It's similar in some ways and different in others. Here is another randomly sampled map. And another, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another. So you can keep drawing these random samples. I only included like 7 in my slides, but I have computed simulations where I have 100,000 random samples. So you have this huge collection of possible maps, and you want to show that the real map there on the left is weird in comparison to all of these other maps. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me show you what kind of analysis you would get out of this. You get pictures that look like this. I'll let this sink in for a second. Does everyone here know what a histogram is? I had a problem with this last time. Okay, I hope you all know what histograms are. So this is using a measurement called mean median. I'm not going to explain exactly how it works, but here's the gist of it. A positive number means it's better for Democrats, the map that you drew. A negative number means it's better for Republicans. I don't mean anything specific by that. That's just how the order of the numbers happen to work out. So this is using some maps of Georgia that I sampled. So if a map were to get measured with this score and got a score of exactly 0, where this yellow line is, that means there was no favor either way for Democrats or Republicans. It was exactly equal on both sides. If a map goes to the left a little bit, that means there was an advantage for Republicans. And what this histogram is showing us, the bulk of the histogram says that most maps that you draw in Georgia are a little bit Republican-leaning. And that makes sense because Georgia is a very red state. Other than Atlanta, most of the state are Republicans, so it's just hard to draw a map that helps Democrats. Does that idea make sense? Now, what this red line here is that is what the original plan, the current plan scored when we measured it. So the bulk of the histogram is right here. The red line is a little bit to the left of the bulk of that histogram. It's not way out to the left, but it is a little bit to the left. So we can take that to suggest that maybe this map favors Republicans a little more than usual because you drew it that way to favor Republicans a little more than usual. It's not proof, but it does suggest it, and it's better than saying, oh, this one number we got was too high. Because now you can say, this one number we got was an outlier from all the other possible numbers that we got. And as long as you sample enough maps, then you should be able to argue that this is actually a representative sample of all the maps. And so this one somehow is not representative of the average map. That you can be sure that Democrats would not have drawn a map that far to the left. Does this make sense? So this idea right now is being used all over the place. It is being explained right now in a Supreme Court case called Russo v. Common Cause, which is ongoing right now. It's been used in consulting with Pennsylvania and North Carolina and Wisconsin, and argued in courts that this is the way we should go. It's had mixed success, depending on who you ask. Mathematicians really like it. Judges don't like numbers. So, you go back and forth. But we think that maybe this is the way to go to argue gerrymandering before a court. And we'll see how that goes out when some current court cases resolve themselves. But I do want to leave you with some of the realities of the situation for gerrymandering. And that is that it is wonderful that we have these amazing tools to solve the problem of gerrymandering. Mathematicians were pretty confident we can look at a map now and argue whether or not it's gerrymandered or whether or not it's normal. And that's great. It's an interesting problem. It's fun to work on. But it doesn't really solve the problem of gerrymandering. That's because, as I mentioned earlier, politicians don't want to fix gerrymandering. They like it. Most most of them anyway. So the Supreme Court would be the way to go. But it turns out, what side you come down on the gerrymandering question depends heavily on your political ideologies, at least in the Supreme Court. Conservative justices say, this isn't our business, we should stay out of this. Liberal justices say, this is absolutely our business, we should get into this. And they've been battling back and forth. But right now, currently, there's a 5-4 conservative split on the Supreme Court. That means there's 5 conservative justices and 4 liberal justices. So to get a decision against gerrymandering right now, you need to flip one of the conservatives over to your side. We've been trying to do that for decades now. It hasn't worked yet. It might work eventually. It's not impossible, but it's been hard. For those of you sort of in the know, Justice Kennedy was the one that we thought we were going to flip, and then it didn't happen, and then he retired, and then we got Kavanaugh, and that doesn't look good. Maybe Chief Justice Roberts is the go-to guy now, but that's not important. So what the real problem is that the maps are going to be redrawn in 2020, right after the census. So it would be wonderful to get a decision on gerrymandering before then, so that we could definitely tell people, hey, this is illegal, don't do this. But it doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon, and there's no reason to think that people gerrymandering are going to stop, because it's not explicitly illegal. If anything, they're getting better at it. They've had 10 years to practice since the last cycle. And even more dire, the 2 oldest justices on the Supreme Court are Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer. Ginsburg is 86, Breyer is 80. They won't be on the Supreme Court that much longer. They will die or retire, and their slots will need to be filled. Depending on when that happens, this 5-4 split could become a 6-3, or if Democrats don't win the next election, a 7-2 split. And if that happens, it's a very real possibility that gerrymandering could be a problem for decades to come, because the Supreme Court seems like really the only way to get something done about it right now. So it's really cool that we have ways to answer it, but also it might not matter, because it's kind of out of our control in many ways. So this is kind of a gloomy note to leave you on, so I do want to tell you this one thing. If you like, democracy and equality and representation, I got nothing for you. It's bad news all around. But if you're just like really into making money, oh my God, you have got to get in on the gerrymandering game. Like, there's no way this decision's coming out in the next 2 years. Just call up your local congressman and say, I know how to use a computer. They'll just throw $100 bills at you. Like, oh, I thought about it so much. Oh well. But it's bad, so don't do that. But if you did, you would make a lot of money. Anyway. So, are there any questions? Happy to take them now.
So, if I remember correctly, I don't remember what year it was, but the Voting Rights Act made it so that if there was a large population of a minority, that you couldn't section them off into different districts to silence their voice. And I wonder, that seems like not only like a legally necessary gerrymandering, that you have to give that community an entirety of a district, but it also seems like the more radical in that case. So what do you think about that?
So you are correct. For those of you who don't know, there's this thing called the Voting Rights Act, and it declares that certain states need to take certain steps to make sure there are minority-majority districts or minority-competitive districts. So like you cannot explicitly silence the voices of minorities. But there's kind of a problem with that in that it just makes intentions a little murkier. So I want to be clear, you are sometimes legally required to gerrymander to help minorities out. Like that is what the Voting Rights Act says. But it makes it also much harder to talk about your intent. Because say that you have a giant cluster of minority votes, and you put them all together, and you say, look, I gave them a district, they win. Well, maybe if you had split them into 2 chunks, they would have won 2 districts. And there's nothing in the Voting Rights Act says that you have to do it in the most efficient way possible for them, you just have to do it. And so that is probably a good thing to ensure that minorities get representation, but it also isn't the clearest argument to make about like gerrymandering or one way or another. It gets murky. Anything else? Please. What do you mean they, and what do you mean voted against?
Like you said, about how right now it's 40, 43, or 46.
5 to 4.
5 to 4.
Yeah.
So if you got more votes, would there be a consequence?
You mean more votes for the anti-gerrymandering side? So what? Presumably, if you could sway a conservative justice over to the liberal side, there would be some sweeping decision declaring it illegal or unconstitutional under some rule. Now the thing is, we don't know what that rule is, and it's almost kind of worrying because it's not clear what they would say the rule is either. Because there have been many Supreme Court cases over the years where the justices say, oh, this is a travesty, an absolutely abomination, here's a rule that fixes this problem. And then that rule just gets abused and it kind of sucks. And it can be difficult to propose a good solution to the courts because they're not math people, so they don't always know what a good solution looks like. So we obviously want them to rule something, but we also want to vet what we're putting before them so they know when something is actually good. Dr. Merkel, did you have one?
How did you learn so much about gerrymandering?
So this past summer, I was a student researcher, or a summer fellow, I guess was my title, at this thing called the Voting Rights Data Institute. So this was a program put on by this organization called the Metric Geometry and Gerrymandering Group, which is co-hosted between Tufts University and MIT up in Boston. So there I worked with people who are basically like the mathematicians doing research on gerrymandering. Like they are the ones trying to solve these sorts of problems and proposing stuff. So as a matter of fact, this idea right here, these slides that I showed you of randomly sampling, this is like within the past like 2 years. Like on my way over here actually, I got an email for the GitHub repository where the code is put that runs this kind of stuff. I got an email notifying me that like some updates had been made to this method. So like my slides might look even better if I reran them now. So like gerrymandering research is currently ongoing and it's exciting stuff. It just in the end it might not matter too much.